In the quiet corridors of Ashworth Manor, where shadows dance with secrets and oil paintings hold more than just pigment and canvas, something extraordinary was about to unfold. For 30 years, the portrait of Lady Margaret Ashworth had hung in silent dignity above the marble fireplace. But on this particular autumn evening, as rain drummed against the tall windows, the painted eyes would shed real tears and change the lives of everyone in the manor forever. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 11 times as Thomas Crawford made his final rounds through Ashworth Manor. As the head security guard, he had walked these halls for over 15 years, but tonight felt different. The autumn storm outside sent shadows dancing across the walls, and the old building seemed to whisper with every gust of wind. Thomas adjusted his flashlight and stepped into the portrait gallery, a long corridor lined with paintings of the Ashworth family dating back 3 centuries. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor as he moved past generations of stern-faced aristocrats and elegant ladies in flowing gowns. At the far end of the gallery hung the most treasured painting in the collection, a masterpiece depicting Lady Margaret Ashworth, painted just months before her tragic death 30 years ago. Lady Margaret had been the beloved matriarch of the Ashworth family, known throughout the county for her kindness and charitable work. Her son, Lord Edward Ashworth, now 55, had inherited the estate, but never quite filled the void his mother's passing had left. The portrait captured her gentle smile and warm eyes perfectly, and many visitors to the manor often remarked that she seemed almost alive in the painting. Thomas paused before the portrait, as he always did during his evening rounds. Something about Lady Margaret's painted gaze had always brought him comfort during his years working at the manor. Tonight, however, something was amiss. The usual serene expression on her face appeared troubled, and her eyes seemed to glisten in the dim gallery lighting. "Strange," Thomas murmured to himself, stepping closer to examine the painting. The artist had captured every detail with remarkable precision, from the delicate lace trim on her blue silk dress to the pearl necklace that had been passed down through generations of Ashworth women. But as Thomas lifted his flashlight to get a better look, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A single tear was rolling down Lady Margaret's painted cheek. Thomas blinked hard and shook his head, convinced that his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He had been working double shifts lately, covering for his colleague who was on medical leave. Surely it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps a small leak in the ceiling had dripped onto the canvas. But as he watched in stunned silence, another tear formed in the corner of Lady Margaret's eye, and began its slow descent down her face. The painted tear caught the light from his flashlight, glistening like a real drop of water. Thomas stumbled backward, his heart racing. In all his years at the manor, he had heard the occasional ghost story from other staff members, tales of footsteps in empty rooms and doors that opened by themselves, but he had always dismissed them as imagination. This, however, was something he could see with his own eyes. The portrait continued to weep as Thomas stood frozen in place. The tears seemed to convey a deep sadness, as if Lady Margaret was mourning something precious that had been lost. Thomas found himself deeply moved by the sight, feeling an unexpected wave of empathy for the painted figure who had somehow come to life before his eyes. As the minutes passed, more tears flowed from the portrait's eyes. Thomas noticed that the painting seemed to be looking directly at him, as if Lady Margaret was trying to communicate something important. The expression on her face had shifted from its usual peaceful demeanor to one of profound sorrow and concern. Unable to tear himself away, Thomas pulled up a nearby chair and sat down facing the portrait. He had always felt a connection to Lady Margaret's memory. The current Lord Edward had often spoken of his mother's kindness, and the staff who had worked at the manor during her lifetime always described her with deep affection. Now, witnessing this inexplicable phenomenon, Thomas felt as if he was in the presence of something sacred. "What are you trying to tell me, my lady?" Thomas whispered to the portrait, feeling somewhat foolish but unable to remain silent. The painted eyes seemed to focus on him more intently, and for a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw recognition in them. The storm outside intensified, sending tree branches scraping against the gallery windows. The wind howled through the old building, creating an eerie symphony that seemed to underscore the supernatural nature of what Thomas was witnessing. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the entire gallery, and in that split second, Thomas saw that Lady Margaret's lips appeared to be moving slightly, as if she was trying to speak. Thomas leaned forward, straining to understand what the portrait might be trying to convey. The tears continued to flow, leaving visible tracks down the painted cheeks. As he watched, mesmerized by the impossible sight before him, Thomas began to notice other subtle changes in the painting. The fabric of Lady Margaret's dress seemed to move slightly, as if stirred by an unfelt breeze, and the pearls around her neck appeared to catch light that wasn't there. The transformation was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Thomas had always been a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, but what he was witnessing defied all logical explanation. The portrait was not just crying, it was somehow alive, imbued with the spirit or essence of the woman it depicted. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself speaking to the portrait, sharing thoughts and observations about life at the manor. He told Lady Margaret about the changes that had occurred since her passing, about how Lord Edward struggled with the weight of his inheritance, and about the various challenges facing the estate. To his amazement, the portrait seemed to respond to his words, the expression on the painted face shifting subtly to convey understanding and concern. Around 2 a.m, Thomas heard footsteps approaching from the main hall. He quickly stood up, unsure of how to explain what he had been witnessing. The tears on the portrait's face remained visible, glistening in the dim light, but as the footsteps drew closer, the painting gradually returned to its normal state. By the time Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the manor's head housekeeper, appeared in the gallery doorway, the portrait looked exactly as it always had, serene, beautiful, and completely still. "Thomas?" Mrs. Hartwell called softly. "I saw the light in here. Is everything all right?" Thomas turned to face her, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had experienced. Mrs. Hartwell had worked at the manor even longer than he had, and she had known Lady Margaret personally during the final years of her life. If anyone might understand or believe what he had witnessed, it would be Eleanor. "Mrs. Hartwell," Thomas began hesitantly, "I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure you'll believe me." Eleanor stepped into the gallery, her wise eyes immediately moving to the portrait of Lady Margaret. She had always been sensitive to the subtle energies that seemed to flow through the old manor, and tonight she sensed something different in the air. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked gently, moving to stand beside him in front of the portrait. Thomas took a deep breath and began to recount what he had witnessed over the past few hours. As he spoke, Eleanor's expression grew increasingly thoughtful rather than skeptical. When he finished his account, she nodded slowly, as if his story confirmed something she had long suspected. "Lady Margaret was always deeply connected to this place and to her family," Eleanor said quietly. "If her spirit were to manifest anywhere, it would be here, in the portrait that captured her essence so perfectly." "But Thomas, if she's crying, there must be a reason." Lady Margaret never wept without cause. The two of them stood in contemplative silence, gazing up at the portrait that had returned to its normal appearance but somehow felt different now, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. Thomas felt a profound responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had been chosen to witness this miracle, and somehow he knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to subside, Thomas completed his rounds with a new sense of purpose. The portrait of Lady Margaret had awakened something within the manor, and he sensed that the peaceful existence they had all grown accustomed to was about to change dramatically. Eleanor remained in the gallery for a long time after Thomas departed, studying the portrait with eyes that had seen many changes come and go at Ashworth Manor. She remembered Lady Margaret's final days, when the gracious woman had spoken often of her concerns for her son's future and the preservation of the family legacy. Now, 3 decades later, those same concerns seemed to have stirred the very essence of Lady Margaret's spirit back to some form of consciousness. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the tall windows, Eleanor made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events none of them could have anticipated. She would speak to Lord Edward about what Thomas had witnessed, and together they would try to understand what Lady Margaret's spirit was trying to communicate to them from beyond the veil of death. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast room as Lord Edward Ashworth sat alone at the mahogany dining table, his untouched eggs growing cold on the fine china plate before him. At 55, Edward bore the weight of his inheritance heavily on his shoulders. The Ashworth estate, while still grand and imposing, required constant attention and significant financial investment to maintain its former glory. Mrs. Hartwell knocked softly on the door before entering, her usual composed demeanor betraying a hint of urgency that Edward immediately noticed. In the 15 years since his father's passing, Eleanor had become more than just the head housekeeper. She was a trusted advisor and one of the few people who remembered his mother with the same fondness he did. "My lord," Eleanor began, setting down her silver tray with deliberate care. "I need to speak with you about something rather unusual that occurred last night." Edward looked up from his newspaper, noting the serious expression on Eleanor's weathered face. "Of course, Eleanor. Please, sit down." Eleanor hesitated for a moment before accepting the invitation. She had always maintained the proper distance between servant and master, but the extraordinary circumstances called for a more intimate conversation. "Thomas Crawford came to me early this morning with a most remarkable story," Eleanor began, choosing her words carefully. "He claims to have witnessed something supernatural in the portrait gallery, specifically involving your mother's portrait." Edward's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. His mother had been gone for 30 years, but her memory remained as vivid as ever in his mind. The portrait had been commissioned by his father just months before her unexpected passing from a sudden illness, and it had always been considered the finest piece in their extensive art collection. "What exactly did Thomas claim to see?" Edward asked, setting down his cup with a slight tremor in his hand. Eleanor recounted Thomas's experience in detail, watching Edward's expression shift from skepticism to fascination to something approaching wonder. When she finished, a profound silence settled over the breakfast room, broken only by the distant sound of groundskeepers working in the gardens. "You believe him," Edward stated rather than asked, recognizing the conviction in Eleanor's voice. "I knew your mother well, my lord." Eleanor replied softly. "She had a deep spiritual connection to this place and to her family. If anyone's spirit could manifest in such a way, it would be hers. And frankly, I've sensed something different in the manor lately, a kind of restless energy that I can't quite explain." Edward pushed back from the table and began pacing the room, his mind racing with possibilities and doubts. As a man of education and modern sensibilities, he was inclined towards rational explanations. Yet, as the son of Lady Margaret Ashworth, he had witnessed firsthand the inexplicable intuition and almost mystical awareness his mother had possessed during her lifetime. "If what Thomas saw was real," Edward said slowly, "then there must be a reason. Mother never did anything without purpose." "My thoughts exactly," Eleanor agreed. "Perhaps there's something troubling her spirit, something that needs to be addressed or resolved." Edward stopped pacing and turned to face the housekeeper. A decision was forming in his mind, one that would require considerable courage and an open heart. "I want to see for myself. Tonight, after the staff has retired, I'll keep watch in the portrait gallery." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "I think that would be wise. And my lord, if I may suggest, perhaps you should approach this with an open mind and heart. If your mother's spirit is indeed present, she'll need to sense your willingness to listen and understand."
The rest of the day passed with unusual tension throughout the manor.
Word of the previous night's events had spread quietly among the staff, creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Some of the younger employees cast anxious glances toward the portrait gallery, while the older staff members, particularly those who had known Lady Margaret personally, seemed more curious than frightened. Thomas Crawford arrived for his evening shift earlier than usual, his face showing the strain of a sleepless day. He had spent hours trying to convince himself that what he had witnessed was merely a hallucination brought on by fatigue and the stormy weather. But the memory remained vivid and undeniable, and he found himself both dreading and anticipating his return to the gallery. As evening approached, Edward dismissed the household staff earlier than usual, claiming he needed solitude for important estate business. Only Eleanor remained, helping him prepare for what might be a long night of waiting and watching. "Remember," Eleanor advised as she lit several candles in the gallery to supplement the electric lighting.
"Your mother was always most comfortable with gentle conversation and genuine emotion."
"If she appears to you as she did to Thomas, speak to her as you would have in life." Edward nodded, settling into the same chair Thomas had occupied the previous night. Eleanor wished him well and retired to her quarters, leaving him alone with the portrait and his swirling emotions. The gallery felt different in the candlelight. The other paintings seemed to fade into the background, while Lady Margaret's portrait appeared to glow with an inner radiance. Edward studied the familiar features of his mother's face, remembering countless conversations they had shared during his childhood and young adulthood. She had been his confidant, his moral compass, and his greatest supporter during the challenging transition to adulthood. "Mother," Edward whispered, feeling somewhat foolish but compelled to speak. "If you're truly here, if you can somehow hear me, please show yourself. I need to understand what you're trying to tell us." For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The portrait remained static and unchanging, and Edward began to wonder if Thomas had indeed imagined the entire episode. But as the clock neared midnight, he noticed a subtle shift in the painting's appearance. The eyes, which had always seemed to follow viewers around the room, appeared to focus directly on him, with unmistakable recognition. Edward's breath caught in his throat as the first tear appeared in the corner of his mother's painted eye. Unlike Thomas, who had been shocked by the phenomenon, Edward felt a profound sense of peace and connection. The tear rolled slowly down the painted cheek, followed by others, creating visible tracks in the oil paint that somehow maintained its integrity, despite the flowing moisture. "Mother," Edward breathed, leaning forward in his chair. "You're really here." The painted lips seemed to move slightly, and Edward strained to understand what his mother might be trying to communicate. As the tears continued to flow, her expression conveyed a complex mixture of sorrow, love, and urgent concern. "What's troubling you?" Edward asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "What do you need me to know?" In response to his questions, the portrait's expression intensified. Lady Margaret's painted hand appeared to move slightly, as if reaching towards something beyond the confines of the canvas. Her gaze shifted momentarily away from Edward, looking toward the gallery's entrance with what appeared to be apprehension. Edward followed the direction of her gaze, but saw nothing unusual in the darkened doorway. When he looked back at the portrait, however, he noticed that his mother's expression had changed to one of protective concern, the kind of look she used to give him when she sensed danger or difficulty approaching. "Are you warning me about something?" Edward asked, his mind racing through various possibilities. The estate faced numerous challenges: financial pressures, staffing difficulties, and the constant struggle to maintain the historic property in an era of rising costs and changing social expectations. The tears flowed more freely now, and Edward could see what appeared to be words forming on his mother's lips, though no sound accompanied the movement. He leaned closer, trying to read the silent message, when suddenly the temperature in the gallery dropped noticeably. The candle flames flickered wildly, and Edward heard footsteps echoing from the main hall. But these weren't the measured steps of Thomas on his security rounds. These footsteps were lighter, more hurried, and accompanied by the soft rustle of expensive fabric. Edward's heart sank as he recognized the approaching visitor, his wife, Victoria, returning early from her week-long visit to London. Victoria Ashworth, formerly Victoria Pemberton, had married Edward 5 years ago in what many considered a strategic alliance between two established families. While their marriage was cordial and mutually beneficial, it lacked the deep emotional connection Edward had observed between his parents. Victoria's practical nature and social ambitions often clashed with Edward's more sentimental attachment to family traditions and the estate's history. As Victoria's footsteps drew closer to the gallery, Edward glanced back at the portrait and was startled to see that his mother's expression had transformed into one of unmistakable distress. The tears flowed more rapidly now, and the painted features seemed to convey a sense of urgency and warning that made Edward's chest tighten with anxiety. "Edward?" Victoria's voice called from the gallery entrance, sharp with irritation. "What are you doing sitting in the dark? And why are there candles burning in here? You know how dangerous that is around these old paintings." Edward turned reluctantly to face his wife, acutely aware that the portrait behind him was still weeping. Victoria stood in the doorway, wearing an elegant traveling suit, her perfectly styled hair showing no signs of the long journey from London. Her pale blue eyes swept the gallery with obvious impatience. "I was just thinking," Edward replied lamely, standing up to block Victoria's view of the portrait.
How was your visit to the city? Victoria stepped into the gallery, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor.
"Productive, actually. I've been meeting with some very interesting people. Investors who understand the potential of properties like this." Her eyes glittered with excitement as she continued. "Edward, we could transform this place into something truly profitable. Imagine luxury hotel suites in the East Wing, a world-class spa in the old servants' quarters, and corporate conference facilities in the staterooms." Edward felt as if he had been struck. The transformation Victoria described would essentially gut the historic character of Ashworth Manor, turning it into a commercial venture that bore no resemblance to the family home it had been for centuries. "Victoria, you know how I feel about preserving the manor's historical integrity," Edward said carefully, glancing back at the portrait. His mother's tears seemed to flow even more freely now, and her expression had become one of profound grief. "Historical integrity doesn't pay the bills, Edward," Victoria replied coldly. "This place is bleeding money, and we need to make some hard decisions if we want to keep it in the family. The investors I met with are prepared to offer substantial backing for a complete renovation and modernization project." As Victoria spoke, Edward noticed that the portrait had begun to change in ways that went beyond the flowing tears. Lady Margaret's painted dress seemed to flutter as if blown by an unfelt wind, and the pearls around her neck appeared to glow with an inner light. Most remarkably, the entire painting seemed to be expanding slightly, as if the two-dimensional surface was trying to become three-dimensional. "We'll discuss this tomorrow," Edward said firmly, moving toward Victoria in an attempt to guide her out of the gallery. "It's late, and you must be tired from your journey. But Victoria had already noticed something unusual behind him. Her eyes widened as she caught sight of the portrait, and Edward heard her sharp intake of breath. "Edward," Victoria whispered, her usual composure cracking. "There's something wrong with your mother's painting. It looks like she's crying." Edward turned back to the portrait, and what he saw made his heart race with a mixture of awe and terror. Lady Margaret's image had become almost lifelike in its intensity. The tears were flowing freely now, creating actual moisture that seemed to threaten the integrity of the canvas, yet somehow the painting remained intact. More disturbing still, Lady Margaret's painted gaze was fixed directly on Victoria, with an expression of unmistakable disapproval and sorrow. "That's impossible," Victoria breathed, stepping closer despite her obvious fear. "Paintings don't cry."
There must be a leak in the ceiling or some kind of condensation problem.
But even as she spoke, Victoria could see that the tears were emerging from the painted eyes themselves, defying any rational explanation.
The sight seemed to hypnotize her, and she found herself drawn toward the portrait, despite her desire to flee from the supernatural phenomenon.
As Victoria approached the painting, Edward watched in amazement as his mother's expression intensified further.
The painted lips moved more distinctly now, and Edward could almost hear words forming in the air around them. The message seemed to be directed specifically at Victoria, and judging by his wife's increasingly pale complexion, she was receiving it loud and clear. The confrontation between the living woman and the painted spirit created an electric tension in the gallery that made Edward's skin prickle with anticipation. Whatever his mother was trying to communicate, it was becoming clear that Victoria's presence had triggered a more dramatic manifestation of the supernatural phenomenon. The stage was set for a supernatural confrontation that would change the fate of Ashworth Manor forever. Victoria stood frozen before the weeping portrait, her usual composure completely shattered. The tears flowing from Lady Margaret's painted eyes seemed to increase in intensity as Victoria drew closer, and the expression on the deceased woman's face conveyed a depth of sorrow and disapproval that cut through Victoria like a blade.
"This is impossible," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling.
There has to be a scientific explanation. Paintings don't just start crying. But even as she spoke, Victoria couldn't deny what her eyes were showing her. The portrait had become something far beyond a mere painting. It was a window into the spirit world, and Lady Margaret's presence was becoming stronger by the moment. Edward watched the supernatural drama unfold with a mixture of fascination and growing understanding. His mother's tears weren't random manifestations. They were a direct response to Victoria's presence and her plans for the manor. The timing couldn't have been coincidental.
"Mother," Edward said softly, addressing the portrait directly, while keeping his eyes on Victoria's shocked face.
What are you trying to tell us?
The painted lips moved more distinctly now, and a soft whisper seemed to fill the gallery.
Though it was unclear whether the sound came from the portrait itself or from some other supernatural source.
The words were barely audible, but Edward strained to understand them. Protect. The legacy. Preserve. What matters? Victoria heard the whispered words too, and they seemed to strike her like physical blows. She stumbled backward, her face pale with a mixture of fear and something approaching guilt. "Edward, we need to leave this room immediately," Victoria said urgently. "This whole situation is unhealthy and disturbing." "You're letting your grief and nostalgia cloud your judgment." But Edward remained rooted in place, transfixed by the continuing transformation of his mother's portrait. Lady Margaret's painted hand had begun to move more noticeably now, reaching towards something beyond the confines of the canvas. Her fingers seemed to be pointing toward a specific location in the gallery, and Edward followed the direction of her gesture. His gaze landed on an ornate wooden cabinet that had stood in the corner of the gallery for as long as he could remember. The cabinet contained various family documents and artifacts that his mother had personally collected and preserved. Edward had rarely examined its contents in detail, but now he sensed that it held something crucial to understanding his mother's spiritual manifestation. "The cabinet," Edward murmured, moving toward it as if drawn by an invisible force. "She's pointing toward the cabinet." Victoria watched with growing alarm as Edward approached the antique furniture piece. The supernatural activity in the gallery had already exceeded her tolerance for the unexplained, and she was desperate to restore some sense of normalcy to the situation. "Edward, please," Victoria pleaded. "Let's go to our room and discuss this rationally in the morning. You're clearly under stress, and this hallucination is probably a manifestation of your concerns about the estate's financial situation. But Edward was no longer listening to his wife's attempts at rational explanation. He had opened the cabinet and was carefully examining its contents under the flickering candlelight. Inside, he found leather-bound journals, family photographs, and several sealed envelopes marked with his mother's distinctive handwriting. One envelope immediately caught his attention. Written across the front in Lady Margaret's elegant script were the words, "For Edward, to be opened only in times of greatest need." Edward's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. He had never seen it before, which meant his mother had placed it in the cabinet sometime during her final months, perhaps anticipating that future circumstances might require her guidance from beyond the grave. "What is that?" Victoria demanded, moving closer despite her obvious discomfort with the supernatural atmosphere that had enveloped the gallery. "A letter from my mother," Edward replied, his voice filled with reverence. "Hidden away for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to be discovered." As Edward held the envelope, the portrait behind them underwent another dramatic transformation. Lady Margaret's tears began to flow even more freely, but her expression shifted from sorrow to one of urgent anticipation. It was as if she had been waiting 3 decades for this precise moment when her hidden message would finally be revealed. Victoria watched with growing dread as Edward carefully opened the aged envelope. Whatever secrets it contained, she sensed that they would not align with her own plans for the estate's future. The supernatural intervention felt like a direct challenge to her authority and her vision for modernizing Ashworth Manor. Edward unfolded the letter with reverent care, noting how well preserved it had remained despite the passage of time. His mother's handwriting was as clear and elegant as he remembered, and as he began to read, he felt her presence more strongly than ever before. "My dearest Edward," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that Ashworth Manor and our family legacy face a threat that requires intervention from beyond the physical world. I have sensed that such a time might come, and I have prepared this guidance for you in hopes that it might help preserve what truly matters." Edward paused in his reading, glancing back at the portrait where his mother's painted eyes seemed to watch him with intense concentration. Victoria moved closer, clearly desperate to know what the letter contained, but Edward continued reading in a voice that grew stronger with each word. "The manor is more than just a building or a financial asset," Lady Margaret's words continued. "It is a repository of family memory, a guardian of traditions that have sustained the Ashworth name for centuries, and a sacred trust passed down through generations. To transform it into a mere commercial venture would be to destroy its very soul and betray the sacrifices made by all who came before us." Victoria's face flushed with anger as she realized the implications of the letter's contents. "Edward, that letter was written 30 years ago. Your mother couldn't possibly have known about the current financial pressures we're facing, or the opportunities available to us now. You can't let outdated sentimentality dictate practical business decisions." But Edward continued reading, his voice growing more confident as his mother's wisdom provided the clarity he had been seeking. "I know that future generations will face pressures to compromise the integrity of our family home," the letter continued. "Economic challenges, social changes, and personal ambitions will all conspire to make commercial exploitation seem like the only viable option. But I implore you to resist these pressures and find alternative solutions that preserve the manor's essential character." Edward looked up from the letter to find the portrait had undergone yet another transformation. Lady Margaret's painted figure seemed to be reaching out of the canvas itself, her hand extended toward him in a gesture of blessing and encouragement. The tears continued to flow, but now they seemed to express hope rather than sorrow. "She's supporting me," Edward whispered in wonder. "Even from beyond the grave, she's still trying to protect our family legacy." Victoria's patience finally snapped. "Edward, this is madness. You're allowing yourself to be manipulated by parlor tricks and coincidental discoveries. That letter could have been written at any time, and as for the crying portrait, there has to be a logical explanation involving humidity, temperature changes, or some kind of chemical reaction in the paint." But even as Victoria spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Margaret's painted gaze was fixed upon her with knowing disapproval. The supernatural presence in the gallery had become so strong that it felt almost oppressive, as if the very air was charged with otherworldly energy. Edward returned his attention to the letter, eager to discover what other guidance his mother had provided for this crucial moment. "If you find yourself torn between financial necessity and preservation of our heritage," Lady Margaret's words continued, "remember that there are always alternatives to wholesale commercialization. Consider partnerships with historical preservation societies selective restoration projects that maintain the manor's character, or educational programs that could generate income while honoring our family's contribution to local history. As Edward read these suggestions, his mind began racing with possibilities he hadn't previously considered. His mother's wisdom, even from beyond the grave, was providing exactly the kind of practical guidance he needed to navigate the current crisis without sacrificing the manor's essential character. Victoria, however, saw these alternatives as naive and financially insufficient. Edward, preservation societies and educational programs might provide some income, but nothing approaching what we could earn from a complete renovation and modernization. You're talking about band-aid solutions when we need major surgery. The debate between Edward and Victoria intensified, with Lady Margaret's portrait serving as a silent witness to their conflicting visions for the manor's future. The supernatural manifestation had clearly taken sides in the dispute, supporting Edward's desire for preservation over Victoria's plans for commercialization. But the letter contained one final revelation that would change everything. Edward, Lady Margaret's words concluded, I have made provisions for the manor's future that should become available precisely when they are most needed. In the event that financial pressures threaten our family home, contact the law firm of Pemberton and Associates in London and request the sealed documents bearing my signature. These provisions will ensure that Ashworth Manor can survive and thrive without compromising its fundamental character. Edward's hands shook as he finished reading the letter. His mother had somehow anticipated the current crisis and made arrangements to address it, even from beyond the grave. The crying portrait, the hidden letter, and the supernatural intervention all pointed toward a solution that had been waiting 30 years to be discovered. Victoria's face had gone completely white as she realized the implications of the letter's final paragraph. Edward, she said slowly, Pemberton and Associates, that's my father's firm. What could your mother possibly have arranged with them? The question hung in the air like a challenge, while Lady Margaret's portrait continued to weep tears that now seemed to express a complex mixture of triumph, relief, and lingering concern. The supernatural drama had revealed secrets that would reshape the future of Ashworth Manor, but the full implications of Lady Margaret's foresight had yet to be completely understood. As the clock in the gallery chimed 2 in the morning, Edward and Victoria faced a crossroads that would determine not only the fate of the estate, but the future of their marriage itself. Lady Margaret's spirit had delivered her message, but the living still had to decide how to act upon the wisdom she had provided from beyond the veil of death. The portrait's tears continued to flow, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made it clear this was only the beginning of a much larger supernatural intervention in the affairs of the living. The revelation about Pemberton and Associates created a stunned silence in the gallery that seemed to amplify the supernatural energy surrounding Lady Margaret's weeping portrait. Victoria stared at her husband with a mixture of shock and growing understanding, while Edward processed the implications of his mother's connection to his wife's family firm.
Your father's law firm, Edward said slowly, his eyes moving between Victoria and the portrait.
My mother arranged something with your father's law firm 30 years ago, long before we ever met. Victoria's mind raced through memories of conversations with her father about various long-term legal arrangements the firm had managed over the decades. Pemberton and Associates was known for handling complex estate planning and trust arrangements for England's oldest families, but she had never heard specific mention of any dealings with the Ashworths. I need to call my father immediately, Victoria said, reaching for her mobile phone. He's retired now, but he still maintains oversight of the firm's most important historical accounts. At 2 in the morning? Edward questioned, though he was equally eager to uncover the mystery his mother had left behind. This can't wait, Victoria replied, her practical nature overriding social conventions. If Lady Margaret arranged something significant with our firm, it could change everything about our current situation. As Victoria made the call, Edward turned back to the portrait and was amazed to see that his mother's expression had shifted once again. The tears continued to flow, but now Lady Margaret's painted features conveyed a sense of satisfaction and anticipation, as if events were finally unfolding according to her carefully laid plans. Father, Victoria said when the call connected, her voice betraying none of the supernatural drama they had just witnessed. I need you to check the firm's sealed document registry for anything involving Lady Margaret Ashworth, dated approximately 30 years ago. Yes, I know what time it is, but this is extremely urgent. Edward could hear the muffled sound of Victoria's father's voice through the phone, though he couldn't make out the specific words. Victoria's expression grew increasingly intense as the conversation continued. You remember it? Victoria said with obvious surprise. Yes, we're at Ashworth Manor now, and circumstances have definitely changed. Can you access the documents remotely, or do we need to come to London? The conversation continued for several more minutes, during which Edward noticed that the portrait's supernatural activity seemed to be responding to Victoria's side of the phone call. When Victoria mentioned accessing the documents, Lady Margaret's painted hand appeared to move in a gesture of approval. When there was discussion of delays or complications, the tears flowed more freely. Finally, Victoria ended the call and turned to face Edward with an expression of wonder and growing comprehension. "My father remembers the arrangement perfectly," she said. "Lady Margaret came to the firm personally just months before her death, accompanied by a team of financial advisors and estate planners. She established what he calls one of the most sophisticated preservation trusts he'd ever encountered." "What kind of trust?" Edward asked, though the portrait behind Victoria seemed to be nodding in encouragement, as if Lady Margaret's spirit was pleased with the direction of their conversation. "A conditional preservation trust designed to activate automatically when the estate faced specific types of financial pressure," Victoria explained, her legal training helping her understand the complex arrangement. "According to my father, Lady Margaret somehow predicted that future generations might be tempted to commercialize the manor, and she created a legal and financial framework to provide alternative solutions." Edward felt a surge of emotion as he realized the depth of his mother's love and foresight. Even in her final months, facing her own mortality, she had been thinking ahead to protect future generations of the family from the very dilemma they currently faced. "The documents are being couriered here from London," Victoria continued. "They should arrive within a few hours. But my father gave me some preliminary information that's quite remarkable." As Victoria spoke, the portrait underwent another dramatic transformation. Lady Margaret's tears began to slow, and her expression shifted from sorrow to one of peaceful satisfaction. It was as if the supernatural intervention had accomplished its primary purpose, and the painted spirit could now rest knowing that her carefully laid plans were finally being revealed. "According to the trust documents," Victoria continued, "Lady Margaret arranged for a substantial endowment to be invested and managed by a consortium of financial institutions over the past 30 years. The investment has grown significantly, and the funds are specifically designated for preservation and restoration of Ashworth Manor." Edward's legs felt weak as he absorbed this information. His mother had somehow found a way to solve their financial crisis from beyond the grave, using wisdom and planning that spanned 3 decades. "There's more," Victoria said, her voice filled with grudging admiration for Lady Margaret's foresight. "The Trust also establishes partnerships with several historical preservation organizations and provides funding for educational programs that will generate ongoing income while maintaining the manor's historical character." The solutions Victoria described were almost identical to the suggestions Lady Margaret had made in her letter, confirming that the supernatural intervention was part of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been 30 years in the making. As the night wore on, Edward and Victoria remained in the gallery discussing the implications of Lady Margaret's trust while the portrait continued its gentle weeping. The supernatural activity had diminished somewhat now that the primary revelation had been made, but Lady Margaret's presence still felt strong in the candlelit room. "I have to admit," Victoria said reluctantly, "your mother's plan is more comprehensive and financially sound than anything I encountered in London. The investors I met with were primarily interested in short-term profits, while this trust appears designed for long-term sustainability." Edward nodded, feeling a profound sense of gratitude toward his mother's spirit. "She always thought several moves ahead," he said fondly. "I remember her telling me that true wisdom involves anticipating problems before they develop and preparing solutions that future generations might need." As dawn approached, Thomas Crawford arrived for his morning security check and was surprised to find Lord Edward and Lady Victoria still in the gallery. The portrait of Lady Margaret had returned to its normal appearance, though Thomas noticed that the painted features seemed more peaceful and content than he had ever seen them.
"My lord, my lady," Thomas said respectfully, "is everything all right?"
"You've been here all night. Everything is more than all right, Thomas," Edward replied, with a smile that hadn't graced his face in months. "My mother has provided us with guidance from beyond the grave, and it appears she's solved the estate's financial problems in the process." Thomas glanced at the portrait with deep respect and understanding. He had witnessed the beginning of Lady Margaret's supernatural intervention, and now he was seeing its successful conclusion. The crying portrait had accomplished exactly what it needed to do. Mrs. Huckove Hartwell arrived shortly afterward with tea and breakfast, and she immediately sensed the change in atmosphere that had occurred overnight. The tension and worry that had plagued the manor for months seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of hope and renewed purpose. "The documents should arrive from London within the hour," Victoria announced to the assembled group. "Once we've reviewed the complete terms of the trust, we'll be able to move forward with Lady Margaret's preservation plan." As if responding to Victoria's words, a gentle breeze stirred through the gallery despite the closed windows, causing the portrait's painted dress to seem to flutter slightly. Lady Margaret's final gesture of approval before her spirit returned to peaceful rest. The supernatural crisis had passed, but its effects would be felt for generations to come. Lady Margaret's love for her family and her home had transcended death itself, providing guidance and solutions when they were most desperately needed. Edward approached the portrait one final time, placing his hand gently on the ornate frame. "Thank you, Mother," he whispered. "I promise to honor your vision and preserve what you've entrusted to my care." The painted eyes seemed to sparkle with maternal love and approval, and for a moment, Edward could have sworn he heard his mother's voice whispering on the morning breeze. "I'm proud of you, my dear son. The manor is safe now, and our family legacy will continue for generations to come." As the courier arrived with the legal documents that would transform their lives, Edward and Victoria stood together before the portrait that had changed everything. Lady Margaret's supernatural intervention had not only solved their immediate problems, but it also brought them closer together through shared experience of the miraculous. The crying portrait had delivered its message, revealed its secrets, and secured the future of Ashworth Manor. Now it could return to its silent vigil, watching over future generations, with the knowledge that its guardian's work was complete. But the story of Lady Margaret's supernatural intervention would become part of the manor's legend, told and retold by staff and visitors who sensed that Ashworth Manor was more than just a historic building. It was a place where love could transcend death itself, and where family bonds could reach across the veil between worlds to protect what mattered most. The tears had dried, but their impact would last forever. 6 months had passed since the night Lady Margaret's portrait had wept tears that changed the fate of Ashworth Manor forever. The autumn sun streamed through the tall windows of the portrait gallery, casting warm light on what had become the most celebrated painting in the estate's extensive collection. Visitors from around the world now came specifically to see the portrait that had demonstrated the power of love to transcend death itself. Edward stood before his mother's painting, as he did every morning before beginning his daily responsibilities. The portrait had returned to its normal appearance after that miraculous night, but something indefinable had changed in the painted features. Lady Margaret's expression seemed more peaceful now, more satisfied, as if a great burden had been lifted from her spirit. The transformation of Ashworth Manor had exceeded everyone's expectations. Lady Margaret's Preservation Trust had provided the funds necessary to restore the estate to its former glory, while creating sustainable income streams that ensured its long-term survival. The manor now hosted educational programs, historical seminars, and carefully curated events that celebrated British heritage while generating substantial revenue. Victoria approached her husband from behind, carrying the morning correspondence and wearing an expression of contentment that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The supernatural events of that October night had profoundly changed her perspective on the manor and her role as its mistress. "The applications for next year's Heritage Fellowship program have arrived," Victoria announced, setting the letters on a nearby table. "We have over 300 qualified candidates for only 20 positions." Edward smiled, pleased by the success of the educational initiatives that had been outlined in his mother's trust documents. The fellowship program brought young historians and preservationists to Ashworth Manor for intensive study programs, creating a vibrant academic atmosphere while providing additional income for the estate. "Mother would be thrilled," Edward said, glancing back at the portrait. She always believed that historical preservation required active engagement with each new generation, not just passive protection of old buildings. Victoria nodded, her own relationship with Lady Margaret's memory having evolved considerably since that supernatural intervention. She had come to understand that the late Lady Margaret's vision for the manor was far more sophisticated and financially sound than the commercial development plans she had initially favored. "The restoration of the East Wing is proceeding ahead of schedule," Victoria continued. "The contractors have been remarkably careful to preserve all the original architectural details while updating the infrastructure to modern standards. The East Wing renovation was one of several projects funded by Lady Margaret's Trust, designed to create additional guest accommodations for visiting scholars and dignitaries while maintaining the manor's authentic historical character. Every aspect of the work had been guided by detailed specifications that Lady Margaret had somehow anticipated would be needed decades after her death." Thomas Crawford emerged from his morning security rounds, approaching Edward and Victoria with obvious satisfaction. His role at the manor had expanded significantly since the supernatural events that had made him famous throughout the local community. Thomas now served as the head of security for the estate's various programs and events, and his account of Lady Margaret's weeping portrait had become one of the most requested stories during public tours. Everything is secure for today's ceremony, my lord, Thomas reported. The dedication of the Lady Margaret Ashworth Memorial Garden will begin at 11 o'clock, and we're expecting over 200 guests. The Memorial Garden was Victoria's personal contribution to honouring Lady Margaret's legacy. Located in the Manor's southeast courtyard, the garden featured flowers and plants that had been favourites of the late lady, along with a beautiful marble fountain and seating areas where visitors could reflect on the enduring power of family love. Mrs. Hardwell appeared with her usual punctuality, carrying a silver tray with the morning tea and a special guest book that had arrived the previous day. As the Manor's head housekeeper, Eleanor had become something of a celebrity herself, frequently interviewed by paranormal researchers and historians who wanted to understand the supernatural events that had saved Ashworth Manor. The guest book from the London exhibition has been returned, Mrs. Hartwell announced, setting the leather-bound volume on the table. Over 5,000 people signed it during the portrait's 2-week display at the National Gallery. The London exhibition had been arranged through one of the cultural partnerships established by Lady Margaret's Trust. For 2 weeks, the portrait of Lady Margaret had been displayed in a special exhibition dedicated to art and the supernatural, drawing unprecedented crowds and international attention to Ashworth Manor. Edward opened the guest book and began reading some of the entries from visitors who had been moved by the story of the crying portrait. Messages came from people around the world, many sharing their own experiences with supernatural interventions during times of crisis. "Listen to this one," Edward said, reading from a particularly touching entry. "My grandmother appeared to me in a dream the night before I was supposed to sell her house. She showed me a hidden compartment containing family documents that completely changed my financial situation. Lady Margaret's story gives me hope that our loved ones continue to watch over us long after they're gone." Victoria leaned over to read more of the entries, finding herself deeply moved by the universal themes of love, loss, and supernatural guidance that resonated with so many people. The story of Lady Margaret's intervention had clearly touched something profound in the human experience. "It's remarkable how many people have had similar experiences," Victoria observed. "Lady Margaret's portrait seems to have inspired countless others to share their own stories of supernatural guidance." As the morning progressed, guests began arriving for the Memorial Garden dedication ceremony. Among the attendees were representatives from historical preservation societies, members of the Academic Fellowship Program, local dignitaries, and dozens of tourists who had been drawn to Ashworth Manor by the story of the crying portrait. Lord Edward had prepared a speech for the occasion, but as he stood before the assembled crowd with Lady Margaret's portrait visible through the gallery windows behind him, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from his prepared notes. "6 months ago," Edward began, "this estate faced an uncertain future. Financial pressures threatened to force us into decisions that would have fundamentally altered the character of our family home. But my mother, Lady Margaret Ashworth, had anticipated this crisis and prepared solutions that none of us could have imagined." The crowd listened in rapt attention as Edward recounted the supernatural events that had led to the discovery of his mother's preservation trust. Many of the guests had heard various versions of the story, but hearing it directly from Edward gave it an authenticity and emotional power that left few eyes dry. "The trust my mother established has not only secured the financial future of Ashworth Manor," Edward continued, "but has created opportunities for education, research, and cultural preservation that will benefit generations to come. Her love for this place and for her family proved stronger than death itself." Victoria rose to address the crowd after Edward finished his remarks, and her words carried a sincerity that reflected her own transformation over the past 6 months. "I must admit," Victoria began, "that when I first heard about the crying portrait, I was skeptical of supernatural explanations. As someone trained in law and business, I preferred rational solutions to practical problems. But what I learned that night was that love itself is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transcending any obstacle, even death." After the ceremony, many guests toured the portrait gallery to see Lady Margaret's painting for themselves. While the portrait no longer wept tears or displayed supernatural activity, visitors frequently reported feeling a sense of peace and comfort when standing before it, as if Lady Margaret's loving spirit continued to bless all who entered her former home. Thomas Crawford had become the unofficial guardian of the portrait's story, and he took great pride in sharing accurate accounts of the supernatural events with interested visitors. His matter-of-fact presentation of the miraculous made it all the more believable and compelling. "People often ask me if I was frightened when I first saw the portrait crying," Thomas would tell tour groups. "But the truth is, I felt honored to witness such a powerful demonstration of maternal love. Lady Margaret wasn't trying to frighten anyone. She was trying to save her family's legacy, and she succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. As evening approached and the day's events concluded, Edward and Victoria returned to the portrait gallery for their own private moment of reflection. The portrait of Lady Margaret hung in its place of honor, serene and beautiful in the soft evening light. "Do you think she's still watching over us?" Victoria asked, studying the painted features that had once moved with supernatural life. "I'm certain of it," Edward replied without hesitation. The crying portrait was just the beginning of her ongoing protection of this place and our family. "I feel her presence every day in the success of the program she envisioned and the preservation of the traditions she valued." As if in response to their conversation, a gentle breeze stirred through the gallery despite the closed windows, carrying with it the faint scent of roses, Lady Margaret's favorite flower. Both Edward and Victoria felt a warmth and peace settle over them, a confirmation that their gratitude and love had been received by the spirit who had saved their family home. The story of the crying portrait had become legend, but its impact on Ashworth Manor and everyone connected to it was thoroughly real. Lady Margaret's supernatural intervention had not only solved immediate problems, but had created a lasting legacy that would continue to inspire and protect future generations. Standing together before the portrait that had changed their lives, Edward and Victoria understood that they were not merely the current owners of Ashworth Manor. They were guardians of a sacred trust, protectors of a place where love had proven itself stronger than death, and custodians of a miracle that would continue to touch hearts for generations to come. The portrait no longer wept, but its message remained crystal clear. True love never dies, and those who love us continue to guide and protect us long after they have passed from this world. Lady Margaret Ashworth had demonstrated this truth in the most dramatic way possible, and her legacy would live forever in the hearts of all who heard her story. As the moon rose over Ashworth Manor, casting silver light through the gallery windows, Edward and Victoria made their way to their private quarters, knowing that they slept under the protection of a love that had transcended death itself. The crying portrait had delivered its message, secured the manor's future, and earned its place in history as one of the most remarkable supernatural events ever documented. The tears had dried, but their impact would echo through eternity,